Welcome to tonight's class, where we'll talk about preparing for the 3 weeks through exploring what the rabbis might imagine God's emotions were at this time. And so the 3 weeks start tomorrow with the fast day of Shivas Arba Tammuz and last for the next 3 weeks until Tisha B'Av, which is on July 26th, I want to say, maybe 27th, the Thursday, 3 weeks from tomorrow. And that time is one of increasing customs of restricting ourselves to set that tone of mourning, however that works for us. And we sent out a pretty detailed letter about it today. If anyone has any questions, big or small, Rabari and I are always available to answer them. And this class is intended not so much to be a review of what those customs are, like a Saki kind of thing, but more about the emotional setting that we want to give ourselves for this time. So I'm going to share my screen and we can start to do some thinking together. Okay. So I wanted us to think about this Gemara from Chagiga. I learned it from my teacher and Rabbi Jeffrey Fox, the Rosh Yeshiva at Yeshivat Maharat. And it is from Chagiga, talking about this pasuk from Yirmiyahu, "V'im lo tishma'uha b'mistarim, tivche nafshi mipnei geva." That if you will not hear it, my soul shall weep in secret, b'mistarim, for your pride. And so Rav Shmuel Bar Inya says in the name of Rav, "Makom yesh lo lahakadosh baruch hu u'mistarim shemo." He offers this sort of radical explanation. What is this pasuk talking about weeping in secret from Mistarim? It says that the Holy One, blessed be He, has a place where He cries, and its name is Mistarim. So Rosh Shmuel Bar Inya is positing that God has emotions and that God cries. And the Gemara says, wait a second, right? Is there really crying before God? Amar Rav Papa, didn't Rav Papa say, Ein atzivut lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu? There's actually no sadness. God experiences no sadness. Shenamar hod v'hadar lifanav oz v'chadba b'mekomo. That honor and majesty are before Him, strength and gladness are in His place, right? So now we have a machloket. We're saying that in Yirmiyahu it says that God cries, and in Divrei Hayamim it's saying God does not cry. God, there's always this sort of joyful nature, this demonstration of strength and of gladness, chadva, that comes before God. And the Gemara resolves this difficulty by saying that the two psukim apply in different types of scenarios. So lo kasha, this is not a difficulty. Ha bevate gabe, ha bevate bare. That statement. And this, just a reminder that the non-bolded words are mostly Rashi or Safaria's genius helping us to understand. But so this is an explanation that the statement in which God cries is referring to the innermost chamber where He can cry in secret. Whereas this statement, the second one, the Divrei Hayamim, that He does not cry, is referring to the outer chambers. Right, so this, the Gemara, as Rashi is explaining it, and as probably is the straightforward read, the first place, right, where God cries is about the innermost place, and where He does not cry is about the outermost chambers. So that's interesting. I would love to hear what people have to say about that idea, right? That God cries in the most innermost piece of God's existence, but not in the outermost, is interesting. But why am I bringing this now? Because the Gemara says, Uvavate vare la, right? God doesn't cry in God's outer chambers. The Hakativ, doesn't it say, Vayikra Adonai Hashem tzvaot, bayom hahu livchi v'lemisped v'lekarcha v'lachgor sak. On that day, this is from Yeshayahu, the Lord, the God of hosts, called to weeping, to mourning, and to baldness, and to the girding with sackcloth. And the Gemara answers, Shani Chorban Beit HaMikdash. Oh, it was actually different on Tisha B'Av. It was different on the day of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. Afilu Malchei Shalom B'cho, because everyone cried, even the angels. Shenamar Hein Elam Sa'aku Chutza Malchei Shalom Mar Yivchiyun. That from that same from Yeshayahu, behold, their valiant ones cry without, the angels of peace weep bitterly. So Chagiga is setting up a model in which God only cries in God's inner chambers, but on Tisha B'Av, God cries even on the outside. So it seems, maybe I would say, that there's something godly, right, something divine, if we are meant to emulate the divine, right? If we anthropomorphize God so that we might understand God, and so that we might walk in God's shadow, right, be created in God's shadow, then it seems like there's a custom, maybe is the right way to say it, right? A custom to cry on Tisha B'Av. If we wish to be like God on Tisha B'Av, then we must shed tears, not just in our inner centers, but in our outer spaces as well. So I want to pause if anyone has questions or ideas, thoughts. Does this resonate? Oh, Nelson is talking, but I cannot hear.
Sorry. Okay, can you hear me? Now you can.
Mm-hmm.
Can you clarify the inner chamber, outer chamber? What does that, is that calling inner chamber meaning secret to himself? Outer chamber is demonstrative? What's that all about?
It's a great question. I think that, yes, that is the way that we're understanding the Gemara right now, is that the inner chamber is somehow private, where we cannot see God, and the outer chamber is where God might be able to see us. And so, right, the idea would be that, like, when maybe I would say our perception of God, right, the outer chamber, the part of God we can see, the outside of God, is one of gladness and strength. But that inside the innermost chamber, God may shed tears over what we don't exactly know, right? But that, I would say, that resonates for me. That's, to me, like sort of a human experience. Is we might try not to cry in public. We save our tears for, when we flee to the bathroom or our car or our room. I'm a big crier, so I've done all of those places, right? But there's that like idea of privacy, of secrecy for the crying piece, and that God cries in both chambers, perhaps on Tisha B'Av. Right? So we, generally we would not see God cry, but somehow on Tisha B'Av we do observe that. And so that's the exception to the rule. God's public face is always that sort of smiling, glad and strong one. And it's only on the inside that God can be vulnerable, perhaps, is what I would say. Although certainly I said that word, and it's not here.
God shows emotions. He shows anger. It can be destructive, and it can be pleased with the creation of the world, in pleasure. So why is he embarrassed to cry? I would like him to cry so that I can feel good when I'm crying.
Yeah. Yes, I agree. And Nelson, as usual, you see where I am going before I get there. No, it's beautiful. There is, as Nelson is intuiting, there is another way to understand. Oh, sorry, go ahead. I can't see everyone, so jump in. Was someone talking? No? Okay, if I don't see you, please jump in, because I can't see everybody on the screen. Rabbeinu Hananel, who is roughly a contemporary of Rashi, does read it the way Nelson is reading it. He wants to understand the ha to be the Divrei Hayamim is the innermost. That sort of that truly glorious, like pure strength model is actually only, we can't even, as humans, we can't even imagine what that would look like. That's only in God's innermost chambers. The God that cries, or Vayichar Af Hashem, right? The God that gets angry, that's the God, like we understand that God. That's the God we might identify with. We can't be pure Oz V'Hadar or Oz V'Chadva, but we can be someone who experiences these other emotions. And so Rabbi Moshe Shapira, who is a modern thinker, a Musar thinker, he develops Rabbi Hananel's ideas here in his book Afike Mayim, and he talks about how it's our inner essence that guides creation to the outer essence. And so from that inside, maybe there's no tears, right? He says, even though from the perspective of the fixed order of the world, we see sadness and weeping, nonetheless, since the inner essence of the divine desire for all is only for the good, in any case, there's only strength and joy in his sanctuary, right? That's the idea from Divrei Hayamim. But on Tisha B'Av is different, for it is an exception, and there is a model of weeping also in the inner sanctum. Right. So here, Rabbi Shapira is as Nelson is saying, is no, the emotions are the ones that we see on the outside of God, our sort of experience of the divine. And generally, God's inner sanctum, the most sort of inner part of God, is only this positive sensation or experience. But on Tisha B'Av, the sadness was so deep, it permeated through the outer chamber into the inner chamber of God. So, I see pluses and minuses to both reads. I think there's something very powerful about the Rabbi Shapira model, which is to say that God sometimes expresses sadness through tears because God is the model for what we do, right? As I said, if there's some kind of sort of divine copying to cry on Tisha B'Av, but that something about Tisha B'Av is so intense, is so deeply sad to even the divine that breaks that barrier, and God even cries in the place where no one can see God, right? It's almost like a waste of tears if they're meant to be demonstrative to us because we can't see them in that inner sanctum. But it's not about showing the humans. At that moment, God was so deeply disturbed by what was happening on earth that God cried on the inside. So I want to take both of those models with us to think about, what does that mean for us? How do we cultivate those kind of tears? I mean, I hope I am not the only one amongst us who, although I cry, for every little thing, that it's hard to cry genuine tears of sadness for a lost temple that has not been standing for so many years. And so I think the question is, how do we find that note, right? Some people find it by watching Holocaust movies, right? Associating other sort of more modern, more emotionally connected losses to the day. I think some of us watch videos of, the Kotel, and watching people go to the Kotel to at least pull on our heartstrings. But I think it's hard. And certainly it's worthwhile. I put this in here only because as I was working through what I was going to teach tonight, I realized that I talked about crying on Rosh Hashanah. And I thought, oh no, I'm like the crying Rabbanit now. Everyone's going to associate me with tears. And I talked about this piece here. And I think that on Rosh Hashanah, what I was talking about was sort of tears of genuine feeling. And I think that the same thing is true here, right? That we say that the gates of tears are never locked, right? That somehow when the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, Shacharav Beit HaMikdash, God locked the gates of Tefillah. Something broke is maybe how I would say, between the connection between the divine and the people. But even with this broken telephone or broken intercom, when we cry, when we're able to somehow access those mistarim of ourself under Rabbi Shapira's understanding, right? That's like a time where God says, I won't turn away that kind of tefillah. And the Zohar, I think, explains it very nicely, saying that tears are an expression of sadness and sorrow, that the celestial beings appointed over the gate of tears break down all the iron locks and bars and let those tears pass through. The prayers of the afflicted penetrate and reach the Holy King. Thus, the prayers of the afflicted do not return to him empty, and the Holy One takes pity on him. Blessed is the man who in his prayer sheds tears before the Holy One. And I think that this idea that God was taking pity on us when we cry, I would say it's a point of connection, right? That's what I think the point of chagiga is that, if you are someone who cries, when you see someone crying, you might feel deeper empathy with them because you understand that experience in a way that, right, God, I think in the general consumption doesn't. But I would push back against the Zohar to say, no, this is the point of connection. It's the place where God says, oh, I do that. Right? God does that in his inner chambers or God's outer chambers. There are tears when things go wrong, and the Chorban is something that went terribly wrong. So how do we get there, and why did I dafka want to teach this class tonight? Is because I think that the 3 weeks kicks off this really important period, and it's something I'm saying only to myself, and I hope everyone will learn something, is that, Yael, when you get to Tisha B'Av and you've done nothing but passively sort of observe the 3 weeks, it's not that meaningful. But if you actually really invest in delving into the 3 weeks, then your Tisha B'Av might actually move you to those tears that God is shedding. So what is the way to get there? is maybe the question. So there's a beautiful shiur by Rav Soloveitchik. I grew up in Boston, where Rav Yosef Ber Soloveitchik was taught regularly. And I actually learned this my year in Israel after I left Boston and went to Midrasha, that Rav Soloveitchik talks about the flip, sort of that crossing of the axes between an Avelut Yeshana, a national mourning, and an Avelut Chadasha, a personal mourning. And he notes that the national mourning starts at the place of what is considered the least or most lenient mourning for a person, and goes to the most intense mourning of a person, whereas a personal mourning starts at that intensity and broadens out. So what does that mean? Phase one of national mourning, we're starting tonight, going into tomorrow morning with the observation of Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, and it lasts until Rosh Chodesh Av. And the things that we generally don't do, that the custom is not to do in that time, are the things that we generally don't do when we mourn for a full year for our parents. So after the Shloshim is over, for the next 10 and 11 months, we observe certain things, right? We don't get haircuts. We might not listen to music, right? And there's like a whole, this is not a space where I'm trying to paskin for anybody, but just sort of those general categories are good examples, right? That if someone's in their year of mourning, they might not go to a wedding, right? Those are the things we don't do in that sort of early stage here. Phase two of mourning, from Rosh Chodesh Av until Tisha B'Av, is more like the Shloshim month of mourning, heavier restrictions, not wearing new clothes, in addition to all of the other ones. And that phase three, Tisha B'Av, is mimicking a day of Shiva, right? We sit on the floor, we don't learn Torah, we put ourselves in that deepest space. And conversely, right, Shiva is the days closest to the loss. Shloshim then broadens it out a little, and then a year. And so what the Rebbe says is that for a personal loss, when God forbid you're mourning someone that you would sit Shiva for, you don't have to like ease yourself into feeling sad. That sadness is like swift and abrupt and immediate. And so the work that one does emotionally over that year of crying, right? The tears hopefully will fall naturally for a person during those days of Shiva. You're working to sort of ease yourself into life after loss. With national mourning, it's very hard to get to that spot of feeling sadness on Tisha B'Av for a national loss. And so you have to ease yourself in. Right? Instead of easing yourself out, you ease yourself in. So you start out slow and then you pick up speed. And it's only if you've sort of started with your year of mourning, gone through your Shloshim, that you can really sit in that Shiva place in a real tangible way. And so I think that the way that we get to Tisha B'Av, to those tears, is to trying to make the 3 weeks meaningful. And that certainly might mean different things to different people, but to not just scooting by like with the barest of requirements, the siyumim for barbecues and all of those things play a role in life, and we have to live life. And in the summer, it's very hard to do a lot of these things well, but to try to do them authentically, maybe whatever that means to us, so that when we get to Tisha B'Av, it's not like, oh, here we go again, this day that feels very far away, but somehow there's some connection, there's some deeper motivation. And I want to finish the shiur portion here with this Rashi from Menachot. We're going to read this later in the summer, right before Simchat Torah. This is the end of the Torah. Rashi is commenting on the Gemara, which is talking about the fact that there's a custom that we say that Moshe wrote the last words of the Torah in tears. That somehow Moshe couldn't write, and he also couldn't focus enough to repeat God's words. He was so sad at the end of the Torah, because that was sort of the end of Moshe's life, that the last words of the Torah were written in tears on the page, like staining the page, which I think is so beautiful, which is to say that tears are really powerful. It's not just that they mimic the divine idea of sadness, right? What does the Zohar say? An expression of sadness and sorrow, but that they're a way of letting our emotions come out. They're a way of expressing ourselves in a way that is so powerful that God allows Moshe to have the last words of the Torah be written in tears. I'm so sorry. There we go. And so I guess what I would wish for us is that we can use these next 3 weeks as wisely as we can to move ourselves to that place of tears, whether it's listening to really sad, sad music about Israel or sad Tehillim, or, whatever the thing is that makes you cry for music, or reading, firsthand narratives of something Jewish or non-Jewish, a narrative sort of similar to ours of national loss or destruction, whether it's watching Holocaust movies. I mean, certainly all of those things I think are very valuable, but that as we use the morning rituals that are designed for us to ease us into Tisha B'Av, that we can get to that place, not where we just cry to cry, and not even where we cry to mimic God, but where we cry to make an impact, to let our emotions out in some kind of productive way. So I would love to hear thoughts and ideas, and then to end with a poem, which is not from a Jewish source. So I wanted to make it very clear. This herein ends the Jewish sources on our page. Any thoughts, ideas, suggestions for how to get ourselves there? Does this resonate? Are you a crier, not a crier?
I would imagine that God would cry when he looks on earth. I think he would be happy and also sad. I think there's a range of emotions of things. There's a range of things that happen on earth, some of which I can see would make God so sad that he would be moved to tears.
It's a great point, Sherry. And I wonder, did that resonate for you that time was Tisha B'Av? Or would you feel like there was another time where God might be moved to tears?
Well, I think there's such a beautiful part of the Jewish religion that there's seasons and holidays and times for different things, that it would be appropriate to do it around Tisha B'Av or during the 3 weeks.
Yeah. I love that. I love referencing the flow of the year. I think that's very beautiful, right? That there are certain times, right? We say v'samachta b'chagecha, right? It's kind of not appropriate to cry at that time. But this is a time, it's the time of year to sort of air those feelings of sadness over the loss that we've experienced. And then we pick ourselves up, right? We listen to the Haftarot of consolation, and we build ourselves back up to a place where we can enter the high holidays, the Yamim Noraim, in a place maybe of more confidence, or at least more even-keeledness. But yeah, I love that. There's a time to cry, certainly, and this seems to be the time.
I often wonder with regard to the Shoah, to the Holocaust, whether there will come a time when it will become, where there'll be created formal and institutionalized forms of mourning, as there are for the loss of the Bet HaMikdash and the destruction, because there was a destruction of a great part of our people, and you would think that terrible loss should also have formalized rituals attached to it.
Like Yom HaShoah.
Yeah, Yom HaShoah, that's on a community level, but it hasn't entered into our, you don't go to shul, there's no fasting, there aren't the ritualized forms of mourning that there are for the loss of the Bet HaMikdash. And
yeah, I think a few things. I think one is that I think there was a discussion of making Yom HaShoah a fast day, and then there was this feeling to lump it in on Tisha B'Av. And I could see it going both ways. On the one hand, right, it does feel sort of different and distinct And we read Eicha. It's not like we don't read a book about Yom HaShoah. And at the same time, I think it's actually like a very smart tool that the rabbis gave us to say, this thing that you might actually shed tears over, let's put it on the day where we're supposed to cry, because that will make it easier for you, right? To reach that space. Like if the Shoah is our Chorban, right? Our experience of the Chorban, why not put them together? And at the same time, it does lose its specialness, and it certainly seems like it would merit a special day. At the Hebrew Institute of Riverdale, where I lived when my husband was at Yeshivat Chovevei Torah for 4 years, they actually have a Yom HaShoah Seder where they eat like potato scraps and something that is sort of reminiscent of that meal that many eat, the Sudam Seket, before Tisha B'Av begins, of the egg with ash on it. So I think some communities do have like a move to do that, but you're right, it's certainly not codified in any way. Do you think it would be easier to cry on that day than on Tisha B'Av?
I'm sorry.
Do you think it would be easier to cry on a Yom HaShoah fast day rather than Tisha B'Av?
I think so, because it was in our time, and many of us are still living who have relatives, close relatives even, who were lost during the Shoah.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I could imagine that if Chagiga were being written today, right, which is maybe roughly even along the same timelines as, right, the Chorban and the Gemara and Yom HaShoah and today, right, sort of the same gap in time, that we might say God cried during the Shoah, right? That even in the chamber where God does not usually cry, that God cried during the Shoah because it was so terrible. I think that we often ascribe to, I had the misfortune of being at a funeral of a very young child a year back. And the rabbi sort of seemed to say similar language, like God cries with us when we lose a child. Right. And I think that those ideas from Chagiga are sort of universal. We want God to cry with us. We want to feel like crying is the thing God would do. When we cry, we are doing the thing God would do. I think there's some like sort of measure of comfort there. This thing was so terrible, even God would cry now. But, it's hard to know where and when the lines are drawn. So Chagiga is pretty clear. The one thing that has merited this in the history of the world, right, was not the Akedah, was not whatever other terrible things had happened in history until then or might happen afterwards, but was just the Chorban. The Chorban is sort of the worst of the worst things. But I think you're 100% right that in today's world, that thing would probably be the Shoah. And that's an interesting thing to think about too, right? That it wouldn't be the Chorban, that the Chorban has been displaced in our life as the saddest thing. And may we not know another even sadder thing, right? That would come after the Shoah that would, I would hate if our children said, what about this next thing? And yet I think that my husband is the grandchild of 2 survivors, and I worry very much that my children will not remember his grandmother, and they will not have memories as I do of sitting in auditoriums listening to survivors talk, right? And so how do we incite those tears for our children on Yom HaShoah might be the answer to how we find that sad space on Tisha B'Av. That's interesting. I'm not sure what I mean. Like I can't think of a practical example, but I think that's an interesting path maybe to go down.
Yeah, I think stories that we tell, particularly if we live them, if we experience them, are the most powerful way to transmit the feeling, the emotion, the sadness, or whatever. I remember there have been moments in my life. I cry very easily. I cry with patience. I cry with friends. I cry whenever I hear some touching, moving story. But there were moments that crying was overwhelming. The first one was my first trip to Jerusalem, and in a bus. I got off the bus by the hotel. It was Erev Shabbos, and the feeling of everybody jumping and singing and crying, and the hotel right there, it's like the whole history came to me in a few seconds, and I couldn't contain myself. So I think it's a very personal thing. Depends on where you are, the context, and your memories.
Yeah. And sometimes when we cry, right, it's not always from a place of deep sadness. Sometimes it's from a place of joy, or sort of, as you're describing, right, recognition of where we are in like the vast world can move us to tears as well. Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I think as a fellow crier, often tears are discouraged. And I do it to my own children way too often. I'm looking at my husband in the next room. I say, "You're okay. It's okay." Right. And what I mean is, it's okay if you want to cry. It's okay. Right. You're sad. You deserve to cry. And I'm not good at it when I witness other people in tears or in pain. But I definitely you're ready. You have a tissue box. I like it. And I think that also, what was the other thing I was going to say? I worked as a chaplain for a while, and I found myself crying at someone's bedside, and I was very embarrassed. And I said, "I'm so sorry. This is your sadness and your pain." And she said, "Actually, I really like that you're crying with me." Right? I feel less alone. I feel like my situation warrants tears, and that is also sort of powerful. So, I didn't make a practice of it. I think it's not really such a good idea, but it is a form of connection. It's a form of saying, "I see that incredible sadness that you're in, and I am moved to sadness because of it," right? Even if the Khorban doesn't feel like our own personal tragedy, right? I think what you said, Tamar, is so right? That we don't know anyone who suffered the Khorban the way we know people who have survived the Holocaust. But to say to God, "Your tragedy is my tragedy," right? Something that moves God to tears will move me to tears, and that tears are valuable. And they're powerful. So I want to read this poem, which I think is beautiful. Again, Rumi, it was a Sufi, I think, a Muslim Persian poet in the 13th century. But I felt very much that his poem resonated with the idea of thinking about tears and how we sort of welcome them in, because again, I think like sort of cultivating or at least welcoming them. So he wrote, "This being human is a guest house. Every morning, a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness, some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all, even if they are a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture. Still, treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whatever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond."
That's beautiful. That's so beautiful.
Thank you. Isn't it beautiful? I felt like it so spoke to me, both this idea that like the tears help us. They sweep out our house, right? Even as Sherry, as you were saying, right, that they get us ready for another season, a season where maybe it's not the season to cry. That's the joy or some other beautiful thing, a guest that comes to our house. And also that they've been sent as a guide from beyond really struck me, that if God cries on Tisha B'Av, that somehow maybe God sends those tears to us, and that we can, maybe we don't have time to cultivate them, right? As I said, I really was talking to myself, and it's often hard to do that. But on that day, if you sit and listen to Eicha, if you sit on the floor, if you're able, or you listen to keynote, right? That is God, I think, helping us welcome the guests of sadness, of grief, of tears into our home, to use them in ways that will help us become better people, better for ourselves, and also better for the nation, better for the bringing of the next Beit HaMikdash. Always a pleasure to see you, Nelson. Yes, I did promise that we would be able to daven mincha. So anyone who has to go, please, I encourage you to go daven, and thank you for making a minyan. But I am here if anyone would like to stay and talk about the poem or anything else.
So
I like-
I'll add my 2 cents to this. Why the holiday is hard for me and why the concept is hard for me is because of its passivity. Because the temple wasn't lost in the sense of what it means to lose something. The temple was conquered by the Roman Empire. And the second temple was conquered by the Roman Empire, the first by the Babylonians, the Sadducees. And so I'm always curious about why the rabbinic imagination didn't go to anger at the, and why isn't God angry? Is so then you have to wonder, well, maybe God is, maybe the weeping of God is for the Romans for being evil. I have made these evil creatures. Look at their power.
Wow.
But the way that it's always understood is, oh, it's our fault, is to blame the
Mhm.
victim kind of thing, which I always find challenging, frankly.
Mhm.
And especially when you rank up the Inquisition and all of them are not things that Jews did.
Mhm. Mhm.
Lord knows there's plenty of failures we've done, but that it is an accounting not of that. It's an accounting of conquering, of the conquering of
Mhm.
and overcoming by imperial armies of various imperial powers. And so, but the absence of that as part of the ritual, I think, is troubling for me.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
I grumpily all through the 3 weeks every year, fasting grumpily and thinking, well, this is really interesting that it's an occasion for inquiry about that problem, but I think it's an enormous problem. And and I've looked, there doesn't seem to be much, no, you'd think someone would agree with me at some point, but no, there's no like sage or rabbinic lineage that talks about this, the need to be angry at the Romans. Maybe I mean, clearly it's not permitted.
Do you
Um,
think you see any of that in the text of Eicha itself?
You see it in the text of Echad. You see it. I mean, one idea I've had about this is that you see it very much as part of within the Talmud, in random moments, random outbursts of anger,
Mhm.
that you see the grief and the anger all throughout the Gemara.
Mhm.
Comes up over and over
I
again.
think that's right, right? They're survivors in a lot of ways. I think, I was thinking in Eicha, like I think when Jerusalem speaks, she is angry, right? She does not feel that she's deserving of this punishment, as you're saying, right? This sort of blaming of the victim. And I think she is angry at God. But there is then also the voice of like the moderator, right? And the moderator is sort of more measured. Well, hey, remember all these times you sinned and brought this sort of down on your head. So it's not, well, it's not just your perspective, and certainly it's not just anger at the Romans, but I do think there's like a little maybe hint of that there too.
But it's a very troubling theology.
Yeah.
Bad things happen because you sin. You're expelled from Spain because you're sinful. I mean, it's just, that there's an interesting problematic moment for
Right.
us.
Right, right. When rabbis try to say that today about floods and tsunamis, right, we push back and we say we actually don't know why things happen. I wonder, how would you feel about the tears being a feeling of God's helplessness, that God has chosen to set the world in motion and the Jews were unable to defend the temple? I mean, I
Well,
think that's powerful
right.
too.
They're
Yeah.
regret when I'm sorry, I'm not a crier. Right. It takes a lot to get me to be at that upset to cry, but it is it's when it happens, it's about regret for something. I wanted X and that
Mhm.
didn't happen, and I'm crushed and disappointed, as opposed to sad, actually. I mean, it's very different. So God's plan for the world, right? But we see God having regret, God explicitly in with Noah, Parsha Noah.
Mhm.
God
Sure.
regretted what he had done. So it's interesting that, and God's anger towards the people when they complain about Moses, when he
Mhm.
says, I'll get rid of these people, I'll give you some happier people, some
Yeah.
cheerier. So there are moments when God regrets the way it's going. But this seems different. This seems just, this utter collapse into grief is much more profound. And, I mean, 9 out of 10 people were killed it's not just the temple's gone, it's that 90% of the population is slaughtered as well, or taken into captivity. So
Mhm. Mhm.
maybe it's an order of magnitude more, but it is interesting. There's not a hint of except for Jerusalem, there's not a hint of, or anything on the ritual that might suggest that people are aware that it was conquering, it was armies and
Mhm. Mhm. Sometimes those tears and anger don't always match up.
right.
Right. And so if it is sort of about cleaning us out or letting us express that feeling of sadness, maybe the regret, I like that framing of regret or powerlessness or disappointment in the way things have gone is
Maybe
like a place where people can access those tears better.
but it's a terrifying thought that God is powerless. Right.
Yeah.
Now Rumi, notice how Rumi brings in malice. So
Mm-hmm.
it understands the
Mm-hmm.
the violence that
The
might also.
meanness. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right, right. In Eicha, in fact, like we talk about God, squashing the people as in the same language that we talk about God squashing the outsiders in other contexts, right? And so it does feel like God could have done it, but God didn't, right? Yeah, I think you're right.
Anyway,
Yeah, those are powerful emotions.
but thank you. It really is
Sure.
interesting.
I am a grumpy faster also. So it's I would be a grumpy faster about the Shoah also, to be honest, I think. Not because I don't feel a deeper or more sort of resonant sadness there, but I have a hard time. For me, it's very powerful to think about showing my tears as a way of mourning the destruction, because I'm a crier, but I'm not a good faster. And so for me, fasting is just sort of like a way of torturing myself and anyone who happens to be in my orbit on that day. Whereas tears feel to me like a much truer expression maybe of what I'm trying to say at that point. I think is why I was drawn to that Gemara in Chagiga.
Mhm.
Anna, did you want to say something? Your box turned green on my screen. Let's stop the share so we can see everyone's faces. Okay, well, thank you guys for joining me. I welcome comments or thoughts later if they come to you. And if anyone has any questions of more specificity around practices, I'm happy to answer them. I hope that everyone has a day that is meaningful tomorrow and is able to kick off a period of sort of more intense mourning for us as a nation. And that leading up to the 3 weeks and Tisha B'Av is meaningful in the ways that best suit us to share that grief with the divine, however that feels appropriate to us. And I hope that everyone stays healthy tomorrow, and I look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, guys.